Welcome again to the Level Paths live stream, where we're looking for the glory of God in clear view. And today we're continuing on in our study of Philippians, Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. And again, we're looking at the Apostle Paul from the perspective of him and his imprisonment. And so, what can we learn from what he's thinking about, what he's praying, what he's writing to encourage and to teach the believers in Philippi and the other churches and individuals to whom he wrote. And today we find ourselves in chapter 1, verses 12 through 14. I'm pretty excited about this passage because I really get a sense of his hope despite his circumstances here in these three verses. And let's look first at the main clause there in verse 12, where he says, I want you to know, brothers. And so he's going to share in these three verses some things he wants them to know. He has some content, more or less a report on how he sees the situation since he's been imprisoned. And then the results of this report. And so let's get into it here. I want you to know, brothers. And then the following phrase, beginning with that what delivers the content of what Paul wished them to know. And so we see, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Namely, Paul's circumstances of imprisonment actually served in the furtherance of the gospel. So this is the report. This is what he wants them to know, that against the odds, so to speak, even though they locked Paul up for his preaching of the gospel, they could not lock the gospel up. And so he's encouraged, he's rejoicing in the fact that his circumstances, though one might think at first glance would hinder the progress of the gospel, have actually resulted in the advance and the furtherance of the gospel. So he's happy to report this. He wants them to know this. And it's important for the church in his day to see this, because they're going to then not be afraid of the circumstances that Paul finds himself in. And it's going to have the opposite effect on them, where imprisonment or threat of imprisonment could cause fear. Instead, it's going to embolden the believers, and they are going to continue to preach the gospel. And so as we look at the results, we see this in verse 13 and verse 14. We see two results, okay? Two results of this advancing gospel. First, he says, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And so the first result of this that he sees of the advance of the gospel, the progress of the gospel during his imprisonment, is that the gospel has become known to the whole imperial guard. And it could be, depending on where his imprisonment was located, this could be translated as it is here, the whole imperial guard, or it could be translated in another way. But it seems that this imperial guard is the way the ESV has gone. It could be the governor's palace, depending on, again, how you view the location of Paul's imprisonment at this time. But we'll just roll with this, that the whole imperial guard has become aware, to whom it has been made known the good news about Jesus Christ. And so, and to all the rest. So we're not sure who that is. Is it the families of the imperial guard? Is it the associates of the imperial guard? Is it somehow the network of the imperial guard? Not sure on that, but basically there's a large group of people who are becoming aware of Jesus Christ, the good news surrounding his death and resurrection, precisely because Paul is in prison. And so he's been put in this place, but it has not kept his mouth shut. He has continued to preach the gospel where he has been planted. And so what we find is in Paul's faithful preaching of the gospel outside of prison, and then his what appears to be his helpless submission to arrest, and then placed in prison, has not hindered at all the gospel being advanced. And so that's just a remarkable thing to see. And then the second result that we see is in verse 14. One of the things that's happened to advance the gospel is not just that those around him where he is have heard, but he says most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord, by my imprisonment are much more bold to speak the word without fear. And so the other thing is that these brothers, the other believers, the other Christians, are much more resolved to speak the word fearlessly. So he has, in a sense, not only reached a niche community of influencers, this imperial guard with the good news of Christ, but Paul's multiplying his evangelistic boldness so that more believers are fearlessly speaking the gospel. And so the gospel has multiplied in many ways here. And as we think of our own circumstances right now, we want to think about it in this way, that no matter where we're located, the gospel goes forth. No matter our location, we still have the ability to speak the gospel. And also, as we speak the gospel in difficult circumstances, so not allowing the circumstances to dictate or to quiet the preaching of the gospel, what happens is more believers become emboldened to speak the gospel. And so we want to learn this from Paul. This is not a time to fear. It's not a time to be quiet. It's not a time to lack industry. And I really want to say that. Paul looks at what he has and he uses it, and as are the other believers in his time. And so what a great message for us this morning as we continue in our own set of difficult circumstances to really understand that joy is liberated, the gospel is liberated, it shall not be hindered. And so we take that with us today. We learn this truth. We take it with us into our own circumstances, and we continue to be bold for the gospel. So I hope this is a blessing to you wherever you are today and watching. We'll see you next time as we continue in Philippians as he talks about all those who preach the gospel from various motives and mindsets. We'll look at that in verses 15 through 18 tomorrow. God bless.